Welcome back to Stories by Prosper. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and get ready for another story you won't forget. Let's dive back to the story. Richard Collins was a man admired across the United Kingdom, a self-made billionaire. He had built his empire through a series of smart investments, acquisitions, and an unshakable determination that separated him from the average businessman. Yet, for all his wealth, what made Richard the envy of many wasn't his money. It was his marriage. Emma Collins, his wife, was a woman of striking beauty, grace, and charm. Whenever they walked into a room together, they commanded attention, not just because of their wealth, but because of the chemistry they seemed to share. Richard adored Emma. He often told his closest friends that meeting her was the greatest stroke of luck in his life. He didn't just provide her with luxury cars, jewelry, and private jet trips across Europe. He made sure she never felt anything less than loved. To Richard, Emma wasn't just his wife. She was his queen. Their life together was a dream every outsider wished they could live. Their mansion in Surrey stood as a monument of their wealth and influence, filled with priceless art and exquisite architecture. Charity galas, luxury holidays, and high-profile business dinners became part of their routine. And through it all, Richard felt certain that Emma was by his side for the right reasons. He believed she loved him for who he was, not for what he owned. But deep down, unknown even to himself, there were small cracks in their seemingly perfect union, cracks that would later grow into a chasm wide enough to destroy everything he thought they had built together. Emma played her role as the doting wife flawlessly. She smiled for photographs, whispered words of encouragement into Richard's ear when cameras flashed, and entertained business partners' wives with ease. But in the quiet of their private lives, she was beginning to show another side of herself, one that was less about affection and more about desire for financial gain. Though Richard had not yet pieced it together, the signs were there. Subtle, but they were there. At first, Richard thought little of Emma's frequent requests for money. He was a billionaire. Giving his wife money to shop, travel, or invest in small ventures seemed harmless. What was a few tens of thousands when he had billions? But as weeks turned into months, her requests became more frequent, more insistent, and sometimes even demanding. She wanted new properties, not because she intended to live in them, but because she believed owning them gave her prestige. She demanded new jewelry collections every season, often mocking the idea of repeating an accessory at social gatherings. Richard noticed that whenever he tried to surprise her with romantic gestures, a candlelit dinner, a handwritten letter, a quiet weekend away, she barely responded, often brushing it off and asking instead for something that cost money. For Richard, this was unsettling. He wanted his marriage to be built on love, trust, and partnership, not on wealth alone. One evening, after she dismissed his attempt to talk about starting a family with a scoff about how children would ruin her figure, he found himself staring at her across the dinner table and wondering if he truly knew the woman he had married. Emma was beautiful, yes, but he began to question whether her heart was as beautiful as her face. The thought disturbed him more than he cared to admit. He confided in Dr. Oliver Bennett, his personal physician, and one of the few people Richard trusted implicitly. Oliver had been by Richard's side through thick and thin, even before the billions, and Richard valued his judgment. "She's changed, Oliver," Richard said one evening in his study, nursing a glass of brandy. Or maybe she was never the woman I thought she was. I need to know the truth. It was the first time he had spoken aloud the doubts that gnawed at him in private. Dr. Oliver Bennett listened carefully, his sharp eyes studying Richard's troubled face. "Richard," he said with measured caution, "you've built an empire because you don't take things at face value. You investigate, you test, you confirm before making decisions. Perhaps it's time to apply that same principle to your marriage." The word struck Richard with surprising force. He had always trusted Emma blindly, believing love meant never questioning loyalty. But Oliver's perspective reframed the problem. If Emma was truly the partner he thought she was, then any test would prove her love beyond doubt. If she wasn't, better he find out now than continue living a lie. It was then that the idea of the accident was born. Richard needed to know whether Emma was with him for love or for money, and the only way to reveal her true nature was to strip away the power and prestige she clung to. Oliver hesitated at first, warning Richard of the risks of playing such a dangerous game. But Richard was determined. "If she loves me, she will stand by me in my darkest hour," he declared. "If she doesn't, then I need to know before it's too late." His voice carried the weight of a man who had already made up his mind. Oliver finally agreed, though reluctantly. The plan was elaborate. Richard would fake a severe accident, rendering him supposedly unable to walk or manage his businesses. The world would believe he was a crippled man, dependent entirely on Emma's care. And then they would watch. Would she remain by his side, devoted as she had once promised in her vows? Or would she reveal a darker, more selfish truth? Richard felt both fear and anticipation as they finalized the plan. The day of the accident arrived. Richard staged it with precision, ensuring that every detail was believable. The story released to the press was that his private car had been involved in a collision on the outskirts of London. Richard was rushed to a private hospital where only Dr. Oliver Bennett had access to his medical files. To the outside world, Richard was left crippled, confined to a wheelchair, and permanently incapable of managing his vast businesses. Emma was informed with great theatrics by Oliver himself, who played his part convincingly. At first, Emma appeared shocked. She cried in public, her makeup streaking as cameras clicked, painting her as the picture of a devastated wife. But in the privacy of their home, the facade began to crumble. When she first saw Richard in his wheelchair, she forced a smile, kissed his forehead, and whispered, "We'll get through this." But her eyes, sharp and calculating, betrayed something else, something Richard could not ignore. The test had begun, and already he could sense cracks in her mask. Days turned into weeks, and Emma's patience began to thin. Caring for Richard was not something she had prepared for. She hired nurses to handle the tasks she didn't want to touch, leaving Richard feeling like a burden in his own home. The more helpless he appeared, the colder she became, and though Richard's heart broke at every cruel glance, he remained silent, determined to see the plan through to the end. It didn't take long before Emma's true colors began to bleed through. The woman who once clung to Richard's arm at parties now treated him with indifference, even irritation, when guests visited. She positioned herself as the poor wife shackled to a crippled husband, sighing loudly and rolling her eyes whenever Richard asked for the smallest of favors. One evening, as he asked for water, she muttered under her breath, "You're not even a man anymore." The words sliced through Richard like a knife, though he kept his face expressionless. Soon, Emma stopped pretending altogether. She began spending nights away from home, claiming she was stressed and needed space. Rumors reached Richard's ears through his loyal staff that she had been seen dining with other men, laughing freely in restaurants while he sat alone in his mansion. The betrayal stung, but Richard forced himself to endure. This was the proof he needed, no matter how painful. Dr. Oliver watched with growing concern as Emma's behavior deteriorated. "Are you sure you want to continue the charade?" he asked Richard during one of their secret meetings. Richard's face was drawn, his once bright eyes clouded with sorrow. "I have to, Oliver," he whispered. "I need to see just how far she will go. Only then will I know the truth." The Emma who once captivated Richard with her grace and warmth was gone. In her place stood a woman who treated her husband as little more than a nuisance. She no longer bothered to hide her disdain. When Richard rolled his wheelchair into the dining room one evening, she didn't rise to greet him, nor did she serve him as she once had with affection. Instead, she pushed the plate across the table with a clatter and muttered, "Eat it before it gets cold." Gone were the soft tones, the gentle laughter, and the touch of a caring partner. Emma had transformed into someone unrecognizable, and Richard, though devastated, endured in silence. At night, Richard often lay awake, staring at the ceiling, tormented by memories of the woman he thought he had married. The cruel irony was not lost on him. He had planned the accident to test her loyalty, but the outcome was more painful than he had ever anticipated. He hadn't expected her to blossom into this cold stranger so quickly, nor to reveal her selfishness so blatantly. For the first time, he wondered whether his heart could survive the truth he was so desperate to uncover. Dr. Oliver, who frequently checked in, found it increasingly difficult to watch the charade unfold. He warned Richard that prolonged stress could damage his health, even if the accident itself was a fabrication. But Richard refused to abandon the plan. "If I stop now," he told Oliver, "then everything will remain uncertain. I need the full picture, no matter how ugly it is." And so, with a heavy heart, he allowed Emma's cruelty to continue unchecked. It was one thing for Emma to show neglect, but it was another entirely when she began to flaunt her infidelity. At first, she was discreet, slipping out late at night, returning with disheveled hair and a faint scent of cologne not belonging to Richard. But soon, discretion gave way to arrogance. She began bringing men into their marital home, making no effort to conceal her actions. Richard, confined to his wheelchair, was forced to listen to the laughter and footsteps echoing down the halls he had once filled with love. Each sound was a dagger twisting deeper into his heart. One evening, he wheeled himself silently to the doorway of the guest lounge and saw her. Emma sat draped across the arm of the sofa, a glass of wine in her hand, her laughter ringing out as she leaned into another man's embrace. Her eyes sparkled in a way they never did when she looked at Richard anymore. The man stroked her cheek, and Emma kissed him boldly, unbothered by the fact that her husband could have walked in at any moment. Richard clenched his fists on the arms of his chair, the rage and despair threatening to consume him. But he did nothing. He couldn't. Not yet. The staff, loyal to Richard, whispered of her shameless escapades, but none dared confront her. They pitied their employer, knowing the betrayal he was enduring. Richard's silence, however, was not weakness. It was strategy. He was gathering proof, solidifying the reality of Emma's betrayal. If there had been any doubt left in his mind about her motives, it evaporated that night. She wasn't just indifferent. She had abandoned her vows entirely. The days dragged on with unbearable heaviness. Richard lived like a ghost in his own mansion, watching as Emma entertained strangers and treated him with scorn. She no longer cared whether he overheard her mocking words. "You disgust me," she sneered one afternoon, her voice dripping with venom. "You're nothing but a crippled shadow of a man. Do you think I want to waste my life pushing your chair around?" Her words echoed in the room long after she stormed off, leaving Richard staring into the emptiness. Though her words cut deeply, Richard clung to a strange kind of strength. His silence became a shield, his composure a weapon. He refused to lash out, to reveal his hand too early. Every cruel word, every careless action was another piece of evidence, another layer of truth revealing itself. Oliver often checked on him, urging him not to let the charade drag too long. "You're punishing yourself more than her," Oliver said one night. But Richard shook his head. "No, Oliver, this isn't punishment, it's revelation. I must see how far she's willing to go." Emma's arrogance grew with each passing day. She had convinced herself that Richard was powerless, that he was too broken to challenge her. She treated him as a stepping stone to the wealth she believed would soon be hers. Richard, though pained, realized that the very cruelty she thought was destroying him was, in fact, sealing her fate. Every insult, every betrayal, every action was pushing her closer to the trap he had carefully laid. Emma's cruelty reached its peak when she began discussing her future openly, as though Richard were already gone. One evening, while dining with a friend, she laughed and said, "Once I'm free of him, I'll finally have the life I deserve. Half of his empire will be mine, and I won't waste it on pity or love. I'll live like the queen I was always meant to be." Richard, who overheard the conversation from the hallway, felt a wave of bitter clarity wash over him. The woman he had once loved more than life itself had reduced their marriage to nothing more than a financial transaction. It was then that Emma made her move. Armed with a false belief that their prenuptial agreement entitled her to half of Richard's fortune, she served him with divorce papers. She walked into the room where he sat in his wheelchair, tossed the papers onto his lap, and said coldly, "Sign them. The sooner you stop clinging to the sham of a marriage, the better." Richard looked up at her, his eyes searching for a trace of the woman he once loved, but all he found was disdain. "Why, Emma?" he asked softly. Her answer was cruel and sharp. "Because you're not a man anymore. You disgust me." For a long moment, Richard said nothing. His heart ached, but his face remained calm. Slowly, he picked up the pen and signed the papers. Emma smirked, her victory already celebrated in her mind. She believed she was moments away from becoming one of the richest women in Britain, free of the husband she had come to despise. But she had no idea that the empire she thought she was inheriting was slipping through her fingers even as she gloated. The divorce proceedings drew immense public attention. Newspapers splashed headlines across their front pages. "Billionaire's wife seeks half his fortune after tragic accident." Public sympathy poured in for Emma, who played her role as the grieving yet determined wife with masterful theatrics. She sat in the courtroom with crocodile tears glistening in her eyes, whispering to her lawyers and dabbing her cheeks with a lace handkerchief. Richard, by contrast, appeared stoic, a silent figure in his wheelchair, his expression unreadable. Emma's lawyers argued aggressively that she was entitled to half of Richard's vast empire, citing the prenuptial clause she had signed before their marriage. They painted her as a devoted wife who had suffered while caring for her incapacitated husband. insisting that her sacrifices should be rewarded with financial security. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, many convinced that Emma was about to secure one of the largest divorce settlements in British history. Emma, brimming with arrogance, barely concealed her satisfaction as she imagined the lavish life awaiting her. But as the judge began to read through the documents, a subtle shift occurred. The supposed clause she relied upon didn't align with the official prenuptial agreement. Confusion rippled through the courtroom as Emma's lawyers fumbled with the paperwork, their confidence slipping. Richard, still silent, allowed the tension to build. He could almost taste the moment when truth would finally pierce through Emma's lies. The trap had been sprung, though Emma had yet to realize she was already caught. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted like a storm breaking. Emma's lawyer stammered, flipping through the documents, his face paling as he realized the foundation of their argument was crumbling. "Your Honor," he said nervously, "there seems to be an inconsistency." The judge, a stern woman with sharp spectacles, raised an eyebrow. "Inconsistency," she repeated. "Explain." The lawyer cleared his throat, beads of sweat glistening on his forehead. "The clause Mrs. Collins refers to, the one entitling her to half of Mr. Collins's estate, does not appear in the official prenuptial agreement lodged with the court. The documents suggest she is entitled to nothing." Gasps rippled through the courtroom like a wave. Emma's head snapped toward Richard, her face twisted in confusion. "What is this?" she hissed under her breath. Richard, still calm in his wheelchair, finally allowed himself a faint smile. For months he had endured her cruelty in silence, and now the moment of reckoning had arrived. The courtroom murmurs grew louder, and even the journalists scribbling furiously sensed a scandal bigger than they had anticipated. Emma's confidence began to fracture. Her painted mask of arrogance faltered as panic seeped in. Richard's lawyer rose smoothly, his tone measured and commanding. "Your Honor, the prenuptial agreement was clear from the beginning. Mrs. Collins signed it willingly. It stipulated that in the event of divorce, she would leave with nothing, no properties, no shares, no wealth, nothing." Emma's hands trembled as she clutched her pearls, her breath coming in sharp bursts. The world she had built in her imagination, her grand future of riches and freedom, was collapsing before her eyes. Emma's composure shattered. She shot to her feet, her voice shrill. "This is a lie. He promised me. He told me." The judge silenced her with a stern gavel strike. "Mrs. Collins, you will not turn this courtroom into theater. Sit down." The gallery buzzed with whispers, the spectacle unfolding like a play. Emma's once sympathetic supporters now looked at her with suspicion. The narrative of a suffering, loyal wife was crumbling into that of a greedy opportunist. Richard sat still, watching as Emma's carefully woven image unraveled. For months, she had worn the mask of devoted wife, but now the truth was laid bare for all to see. He recalled the night she berated him, the men she paraded into his home, the venom in her words as she declared him less than a man. The bitterness welled inside him, but so too did a quiet triumph. She had betrayed him, and now she was paying the price. Emma turned desperately to her lawyer, whispering furiously, but the man shook his head, defeated. There was no legal ground left to stand on. The ironclad prenuptial agreement stripped her of every entitlement. Her future, the wealth she had sacrificed her marriage for, was slipping through her grasp like water. And in that moment, Emma realized she had lost more than money. She had lost a man who had once loved her with all his heart. For the first time since the staged accident, Richard spoke directly to Emma in the courtroom. His voice was calm, but it carried a weight that silenced the room. "Emma," he began, "you think I am a fool. You thought I was helpless, broken, easy to discard. But the truth is, I was never crippled. I was never helpless. Every word, every action, every betrayal, I witnessed it all, not as a victim, but as a man testing the woman he loved." His words struck Emma like physical blows. Her knees wobbled, and she gripped the edge of the table for support. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Journalists dropped their pens in disbelief. The gallery gasped, and the judge leaned forward, her stern expression betraying a flicker of curiosity. Emma shook her head violently. No, that can't be true," she cried, but Richard's steady gaze told her otherwise. The truth she dreaded was standing before her, undeniable and brutal. Richard continued, his eyes unblinking. "I want to know if you love me for me or for the money. And now I have my answer. You never loved me, Emma. Not once." His voice broke slightly at the end, the pain evident even through his controlled demeanor. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Emma's choked sobs. Emma's arrogance crumbled into desperation. She fell to her knees in the courtroom, tears streaming down her face. "Richard, please," she cried, her voice raw with panic. "I made mistakes, yes, but I was scared. I didn't know how to handle it. I thought I was losing everything. Please, give me another chance. Don't do this to me." The spectators whispered in disbelief as the once proud Emma Collins reduced herself to a begging shadow of her former self. Richard looked down at her, his heart heavy. Part of him remembered the woman he had once loved, the woman he had showered with affection and built a life for. But those memories were tainted now, overshadowed by the cruelty, betrayal, and greed she revealed. Her pleas sounded hollow, insincere, like the words of a woman trying to cling to the remnants of her crumbling empire. "Another chance?" Richard repeated bitterly. "I gave you every chance, Emma. And every time you chose money over me. You humiliated me. You mocked me. You brought strangers into our home. And now, when everything is gone, you suddenly remember love." Emma reached for him, her hands trembling, but Richard pulled his chair back slightly, his face cold. "It's too late." That night, after the hearing adjourned, Richard sat alone in his study, replaying the events of the day. Though he had won, his heart was not at peace. He thought back to the early days of their relationship, when Emma's laughter had seemed genuine, when her eyes had sparkled not with greed but with warmth. He remembered the nights they spent dreaming about the future, the kisses they shared on balconies overlooking city skylines, the promises whispered in the dark. Were those moments real, or had it all been an illusion carefully crafted to ensnare him? The weight of betrayal bore down on him. Though Emma had wronged him beyond repair, Richard could not deny the pain of losing her, not just as a wife, but as the woman he once believed was a soulmate. Betrayal was cruel not only because it revealed lies, but because it poisoned the memories of what once felt true. Richard poured himself a glass of brandy, staring at the amber liquid as though it held answers. "How did I not see it sooner?" he whispered to himself. Oliver's words echoed in his mind. You needed to test her. The test was complete, but the cost had been his heart. Emma sat in her hotel room that night, the weight of her downfall pressing on her chest like a vice. The mirror reflected a broken woman, mascara streaked, eyes red, lips trembling. For years, she had told herself that she deserved more, that money equaled happiness, that love was secondary. But now, staring at her own hollow reflection, she realized how wrong she had been. She had traded the only man who had truly loved her for a fantasy that had crumbled to dust. Her mind replayed Richard's words in court, his voice laced with pain. "You never loved me." The truth burned her like fire. Had she ever truly loved him? She thought back to the first time he surprised her with a bouquet of roses, the first time he held her hand in public, the way he looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. Maybe once she had felt something real, but greed had twisted it, turning her heart cold. Tears flowed freely as regret consumed her. "What have I done?" she whispered to herself. She wanted to run to Richard, to fall at his feet, to beg for forgiveness not for the money, but for the love she had destroyed. But deep down, Emma knew the truth. She had lost him forever. The media pounced on the scandal with voracious hunger. Headlines screamed, "Emma Collins exposed as greedy betrayer. Billionaire's wife left with nothing," and the test that shook the nation. Paparazzi hounded her, capturing photos of her leaving hotels in disarray, her once pristine image shattered beyond repair. Social circles that once embraced her now shut their doors. She was no longer the glamorous wife of a billionaire. She was a cautionary tale, a fallen queen stripped of her crown. Richard's businesses thrived, his reputation bolstered by public sympathy. Many hailed him as a visionary, not only in finance, but in his personal resilience. Emma, on the other hand, became the subject of ridicule and scorn. Friends she once dined with at exclusive restaurants now avoided her calls. Invitations stopped arriving. She was alone, abandoned by the very world she had once sought to impress. Emma wandered the city streets at night, her designer clothes feeling like chains. She had money left from her personal accounts, but it dwindled quickly, and with it went the illusion of power. Everywhere she turned, she saw Richard's face on billboards, in newspapers, in her own memories. His absence was louder than his presence had ever been. She had lost not just wealth, but her identity. Despite his victory, Richard was not immune to inner conflict. In his moments of solitude, he wrestled with conflicting emotions. He had exposed Emma's betrayal and ensured justice was served, yet the hollow ache in his chest remained. Love, once so abundant, had curdled into bitterness. He wondered if he would ever be able to trust again, or if the scars left by Emma's deceit would haunt him forever. Oliver often visited, offering support. "You did what you had to," he told Richard. "Better to suffer now than live a lifetime with a lie." But Richard wasn't sure. He had seen Emma's breakdown, her desperation, her pleas. Part of him wondered whether beneath the greed there had ever been a trace of love. The question tormented him because he knew he would never truly have the answer. Nights were the hardest. Alone in the vast mansion, Richard felt the silence pressing in. Memories of laughter echoed faintly in the halls, now replaced with emptiness. Though he had built an empire, though he had exposed the truth, he realized that victory did not always bring peace. Sometimes it left only questions and wounds too deep to heal. Weeks later, Emma made one final attempt to reclaim what she had lost. She appeared at Richard's mansion unannounced, her once flawless appearance replaced by humility. She wore no makeup, no jewels, just a simple coat. Her eyes were swollen from sleepless nights, her voice shaky. "Richard," she whispered when the butler reluctantly let her in. "Please, just hear me out." Richard sat in his study, his expression unreadable as she approached him. "I don't want your money anymore," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I know I've lost everything, but I can't live without you. I was blind, Richard. I let greed poison me. But I remember the man I fell in love with. I remember your kindness, your love. Please, give me a chance to make it right." She fell to her knees, clutching his hands, her sobs filling the room. Richard looked down at her, his heart heavy. For a brief moment, he saw the woman he once adored, stripped of arrogance and pretense. But then he remembered the men she had brought into his home, the cruel words she had spat, the laughter she shared while mocking his supposed disability. His jaw tightened. "Emma," he said softly but firmly, "love without loyalty is nothing, and trust, once broken, can never be restored." Her sobs deepened, but Richard turned away, signaling the butler to escort her out. In the months that followed, Richard focused on rebuilding not just his empire, but himself. He poured his energy into philanthropic ventures, establishing charities that supported victims of betrayal, abandonment, and broken families. His name, once tied to scandal, became associated with resilience and hope. Slowly, he found a sense of purpose beyond wealth. Emma, on the other hand, faded into obscurity. She lived a quieter life, haunted by regret. Sometimes, she would see Richard's face on television, smiling as he handed over large donations or speaking about second chances in life. Her heart would ache, knowing she had been given a chance once and thrown it away. She became a ghost of her former self, a woman defined not by glamour, but by the weight of her mistakes. For Richard, life was not without scars, but he learned to carry them with dignity. The test had cost him dearly, but it had also freed him from a life built on lies. As he stood on the balcony of his mansion one evening, watching the sun set over the horizon, he whispered to himself, "Better alone in truth than together in lies." And for the first time in months, he felt peace. That's all for today. Like, subscribe, and see you in the next episode. Stay tuned.